when I hear you speak, I realize that there's so much BS going on around and we have no freaking idea. And individuals like yourselves are the ones who understand what the hell is going on. And it seems like, we need more people to be listening to you because you're really digging in deep and trying to find out what really exists behind the scene. Because nowadays, especially with social media, it's like really easy to push a propaganda and an agenda. And well, nowadays we are lazy to really like dig and find information and find what the hell is going on. So it's really important to have individuals like yourself because you're also really risking your life for all this.
So I think that in one of the biggest disservices that has been done to Africa, because I think what I do as not just a Nigerian thing, but more of like I think of it as an African thing. So even my platform is called West Africa Weekly, which is sort of like an aspirational name, even though most of the stories are Nigerian. But the plan is to expand into the West African sub-region and someday possibly into the wider African continent. Now, um, I think one of the biggest disservices that has been done to Africa and to the African information ecosystem is the lack of development of independent voices in this ecosystem. I think part of the reason that is widespread cheap internet access is still a relatively recent thing across most of the continent. So in Nigeria, for example, statistically, most Nigerians now are online. I think something like 88% of the country has access to the internet now. But statistically, most of that 88% came online between 2011 and now. So whereas much of the world outside has had internet access since the 1980s, right? There were people who went to university in the UK in 1989 who already had internet access in their dorm rooms. Statistically, in Nigeria, most people didn't get online until sometime within the past decade. So as a result, where the rest of the world has had a head start in creating sort of alternative information ecosystems outside of the established legacy media platforms, which are obviously controlled by people with economic and political power, we didn't have that advantage. So that's what people like me are trying to build now, belatedly, right? Because we have had that disadvantage of starting late. We are literally the last continent to get this thing off the ground on Earth. Every other continent on Earth had internet access at least since the early 2000s, and they've already been sort of creating these ecosystems. We were like 10, 12 years late, sometimes more. So what I'm trying to do now, regardless of the risk involved, and what people like me are trying to do now, regardless of the risk involved, is create these alternative information ecosystems, not just news, but information ecosystems. And why these are so important is that even in the political evolution of Africa as a civilization, um, that access to information, I think, has been one of the biggest breaks on African political growth, on African political development over the past half century, if not the past century, because the people who control information, people who control the radio stations, if I'm not mistaken, radio is like by far the most accessible form of mass media in Africa till date. So those who control the radio stations, the TV stations, the newspapers, those are the people who traditionally have controlled what information gets into African heads. And the information that is getting into your head is the information that determines what economic and political decisions that you are making. So basically, the people in whose interests it is for Africa to have remained the way it is are the people who have been in control of the information for decades. So what this democratization of information is doing and what it promises to do on a much wider scale as it becomes bigger is to completely disrupt that model of certain people being in control of people's minds by making information, high quality information, so readily available and so easily accessible that basically a different political paradigm can be created. So it can be argued, for example, that the Nigerian elections, in as much as it's kind of like an ongoing car crash, as I think we're going to discuss further on in this episode, but in as much as we're witnessing like a car crash in real time, it's also the case that the reason we're even witnessing that car crash to begin with the reason there are even that many young people who have registered to vote, and the reason there is this much interest and there's this much participation in the political process this time around, in the electoral process this time around, is precisely because the efforts of people who work in this alternative information space. That includes me, that includes people who do things on social media, websites like Twitter and Facebook. That includes other independent platforms. That includes just generally that new internet ecosystem. It has incubated a whole new political space that simply didn't exist before. So there have been 20 or 30 million new, what's it called, the voter registrations in this political cycle. Voter registrations which simply wouldn't have happened otherwise. And the reason these things are happening now is because these new voters who are almost unanimously under the age of 25, sorry, almost almost entirely under the age of 30, feel like they've been energized by this information that they've got access to, information which they would definitely not have been able to get access to if it was still restricted to radio, TV, and newspapers, which are owned by the legacy players. So regardless of the risk involved, me and people like me, what we are trying to do is accelerate this thing, make the current political system in Africa unsustainable, make the current system unfeasible by flooding the public space with high quality information that renders the sort of filtered, censored information from the legacy sources, basically renders it irrelevant, renders it moot. That's what we're trying to do.